So all of us have, or definitely will be there if you want to plant a church, preach to a small crowd, a small audience. And of course, it can be awkward. It might feel uncomfortable, particularly if you do not have a lot of experience. And so in this episode of Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 5 tips for preaching to a small crowd.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Adrozi, and joining me today, to my left, you're right, is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 5 tips for preaching to a small crowd. Dylan, are we ever going to preach to a small crowd in planting a church?
Never. So you're likely going to be in this situation.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what do you do when you preach to a small crowd? There can be tendency to do a lot of things that you should not want to do. Mm-hmm. And we've been there. I've been there. I mean, even just recently, if you've been following along, we told you that we tried Thursday night services and we cut them down because it's 3 services that our space was tough. So we were just trying it. It was like small.
Yeah.
Very small. Like 11 people.
Right.
Small.
Yep.
And I mean, it's fine because people knew it was going to be different. But this is not just this is me just giving you what just happened.
That works.
So tips for what you do in that situation, which you likely, if you're planning a church, have done it. Even if your Sunday gathering is large, when you first started launch team gatherings or anytime you try something new, you're going to be there. So what do you do?
You know, it can be a little awkward at first if you're preaching to a small crowd. The first time Dylan and me preached, which, I mean, this is everyone's first time preaching, was Thanksgiving weekend. Weekend after Thanksgiving, whatever it is, which is like historically the smallest weekend ever. And so it makes sense where you put someone inexperienced to preach there, but at the same time, it's like, oh, this is the smallest Sunday, so this is really uncomfortable. So.
Especially if you don't have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
It feels even worse than it probably is. And so here are some tips. Number 1, this one that's not so much a tip as just something to think about, which I guess if you think about it, it can be helpful.
Your tip is to think about this one.
It's that people don't think it's as small as you.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not talking about they count differently than you do, but every time I'm concerned and I say something to someone afterwards, they're like, what are you talking about? Even the Thursday night thing when I said there was 11 people, that's still not, to them it didn't seem, I mean, obviously it was smaller than what we normally do, but they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about who else here like we are. And so a lot of times it can be in your head and you can feel like it's awkward or it's weird when to the average person, it's just it is what it is, especially if it's a church plant and you're new and you're small and you've got relatively the same numbers every week. To them, that's normal. To you, you might go to conferences or you might have worked at previous churches where it was bigger. And so you're like, well, this is weird. But most people just don't think about it. And so the encouragement is to just realize that they don't think it's as small as you think it is.
Yeah. I mean, as long as the people sitting kind of in their immediate vicinity isn't empty, I think most people are pretty okay with it. If you're sitting in a row and even if behind you there's hardly anybody, but there's a few other people in the row to where within arm's distance there are people, I think most people think this isn't a big deal. Even if maybe you're a year in and people are used to it being more full or whatever, and this is a Sunday where it's less, I think most people are kind of just maybe, I don't know, think about it for a second, but really don't give it the thought that you are when you're looking out at the crowd and being like, whoa, there are way more empty chairs than full chairs here. There's just, people don't really notice.
Right. And of course, it's all relative. So maybe you have, 1 weekend it's super small or 1 week it's bigger or you just don't, whatever it is, just generally speaking, it's a bigger deal to you on stage than it is out there.
Yeah. And even if people do notice, most of the time they're not thinking it as this giant negative. You may be thinking.
Right. They're just thinking, it's less this week.
Whatever. It's raining. Where you might be like, what's going on? They're just, whatever.
So remember that. It's not as small. I mean, it is what it is, but people don't think it's as small as you are.
Yeah.
Here's number 2. Pretend that there are more people. So this is one helpful thing to do because you could sit there and be like, well, there's only however many people it is, 20 people or whatever. And so I guess I'll just do this differently. One of the things that's helpful to do is to pretend and to look if you don't have a lot of people, it's okay to not stare at everybody's eyes. Look over their heads a little bit. Look to the left or to the right. I mean, obviously, if there's no one anywhere and you're just looking all over the place, it's weird. But I found even when there's not a lot of people in the room, if you kind of just pretend that there is and kind of look around, people are just oh, he's looking at. They're not looking around and say, where's this person looking? And so just in your mind, if there was twice as many people, how would you feel? And preach to that as opposed to feeling like there's nobody there.
And people can tell if you think that the room is empty.
Right.
If you're preaching, and we'll talk about this a little more of different things to avoid, but if you're preaching the room is empty, people are feeling this, you don't care about the ones that are here. So one thing I did when I, the first few times I preached, and probably still do, is as I'm kind of going through things, since I don't, preaching isn't like in my regular rotation, it's kind of a rare thing for me, is I'll take during the week and I'll actually like give my message from the stage here. I mean, not everyone can do this because we have a permanent space, but like do it from the stage to an empty room, and no one else is in the building, so I don't feel like insane. But like I'm giving it to an empty room, and because I know like I don't know what Sunday is going to be, so if I can get comfortable speaking to nobody, then at least if somebody's here, it won't be so so uncomfortable. So just I mean, not treating it like you're going over the top, like you're pretending like you're talking to a stadium, but just like, hey, this is a normal Sunday, regardless of what it looks like, and I'm going to treat it like a normal Sunday.
Yep. So again, just a little mind trick for you. Pretend there are more people.
Fool yourself.
Number 3, don't apologize or reference the numbers.
This is the biggest one to me.
Like, don't say, hey, we normally have more people, or hey, I'm so glad you guys came, so-and-so isn't here, or this people aren't here, or like...
Or it's raining.
Yeah, like, it's raining.
The weather today.
Yeah, A, people kind of understand that, but B, they're not thinking about it. And so once you draw attention to something, it then becomes awkward. And I get it. It's hard. Like maybe there's a new person that you've been inviting and they finally come and you don't want them to think that it's always like I understand, but nobody is thinking this way except for us. And so when you then voice it, then they're looking around, they're like, oh, I guess this is weird. I didn't know. And I mean, I just thought, and so I know it's hard because you want to but it's just don't say anything.
And this is one of the ones where I feel like no one plans to do this.
Right. Yep.
But it just like, you just feel like you have to address it. Like, especially if it's lower than usual, you feel like they're expecting me to say something or something like that. And it just don't. And I feel like this is a good tip for any time during your message. Like if we encourage you to have people do like next steps or announcement kind of things. We call them next steps, and don't say it from there either. And that can be kind of more comfortable or more, it seems more normal too, because that's usually at the beginning of service, at least for us. And it can be really easy to be like, well, we're going to get started with who we got here, something like that. And I mean, we've had times where Kevin, our guy who leads worship, our worship leader, has had to like make a joke about like how he's starting worship for the people in the lobby because no one was in the auditorium yet. Like literally nobody was in here because people were talking outside. But it's just like, if you bring attention to it, it just makes it doesn't like, what's the word? It doesn't like alleviate the tension. It doesn't make people like, oh, okay. It makes it so much more tense. Like, oh, this is awkward now.
Right. So it's hard. It's hard.
Ignore it.
And like you said, you plan on, I'm not going to say anything, and then you just like can't help yourself.
Yeah.
Help yourself.
Help yourself.
Right.
Good advice.
Don't apologize or reference the numbers. Number 4, avoid the temptation not to preach. So again, this kind of goes with pretending there's more people there.
Yeah.
But again, you could be like, well, there's only 25 people and this seats more, whatever it is. And so I'm afraid of like going over the top or saying anything, so I'm going to like be more laid back. And I get the tendency. Now, of course, you don't want to pretend like you're speaking to 5,000 people.
Right, yeah.
But you should preach how you would preach if the room was full. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to our Thursday night examples, I felt like this is kind of weird when we first started doing it because it's obviously much less than our Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And I even asked a few people, I'm like, does this feel weird? They're like, we don't. Like, that's fine. And so what happens too is, especially when there's less people, depending on the size of your room, people are kind of depending on you to bring energy and reason for them to listen.
Yeah.
And so the less people that there is more on you. Not that this is like a performance or like, we're not saying that.
Right.
But it's up to you to give people a reason to listen and to be engaging or however you're gifted in whatever way. But avoid the temptation not to do what you think you should do. People won't feel awkward. They'll feel awkward if you don't do it. If you absolutely are different than what you normally are. And I know it feels weird, especially if you haven't done it a lot, to like still preach normally. But preach like you would preach. Because again, people aren't looking around. They're looking at you and they're thinking like, okay, what am I going to get out of this? Mm-hmm. And if you're engaging, they'll listen to you regardless of how many people are there.
I think what you said there is a good little piece of advice of preach like your room is full, and your room as in like how many chairs you're using. Like if you're in a school auditorium that seats 500, but you pipe off all but 50, preach like those 50 are full.
Yeah. Yep.
Like don't act like you're this mega church and like, trying to make it be like something you're just really not, but also like don't preach like there's 2 people there. Like just, I think kind of that medium of like the room is full to like, this is our context and I acknowledge that, but also I acknowledge that it is generally bigger, or like maybe I just want it to grow a little bit and fine, whatever. But like, I think that kind of medium of I'm going to preach to the amount of chairs I have. I'm going to preach to the chairs. That's terrible. I mean, whatever. But you get what I'm saying.
Right.
I think that's a good kind of thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. So again, I know it's hard, but preach like normal,
Preach like normal.
and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
Avoid
Don't
the
not
temptation.
preach.
And then number 5, this one's also really important too, is that a lack of response doesn't necessarily equal a lack of engagement. Now it could, but
it can.
It doesn't. And what we mean by that is maybe you have a joke, or maybe you say something and you thought that it was going to connect well, or maybe people kind of laughed a little bit, but not like laughed out loud.
You just didn't get the moves you wanted.
Yeah, you didn't. As we say, the white people, amen. If you go to a predominantly white church, you know what I'm talking about. We say, Anyway, if you don't get whatever it is in your context, you could assume, like, you can freeze up and be like, well, okay, that was awkward, or that was weird. And now everyone's like, a lot of times I found after the fact, like, people, they thought it was funny. They were still listening. There was just not a ton of people, which part of it is like, if everyone's spread out, like, they're not going to engage the way that they just would. Like, it's just human nature. So still go for your jokes or whatever you have. Still go for your energy, and don't just assume that because you didn't get this big response that it's all of a sudden everyone's like staring at you awkwardly, because they're not.
Yeah, and don't. Well, this is a little bit of a tough kind of piece of advice, because like there are times I think you can acknowledge it, but err on the side of don't acknowledge it than do, because like nothing is more awkward than like kind of an awkward moment followed up by acknowledging that it was an awkward moment, unless
it's terribly awkward.
I say unless it fits. Like it's kind of hard to give that advice, because there are times where it fits, but most of the time it doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's hard to kind of toe that line. But like, I mean, don't make it more awkward than it needs to be. I mean, it doesn't need to be awkward at all. And so those times, like if I mean, maybe if it's like your first handful of times preaching, but if you've been preaching for a while, you kind of know what you should and shouldn't say. And if it's something that you kind of know that you should say, or it fits in fine, go with it. And don't apologize for going with it because you don't get this big response.
There have been plenty of times after the fact where we talked, on Monday with staff or whatever, and I was like, I shouldn't have said that. Nobody laughed like I thought they would. People were like, well, no, it wasn't hilarious, but it was still worth having.
Right. And also people like, I point out here, people know we're doing this from the stage. So I point to our chairs. People that are, in your crowd, they can kind of feel if people are reacting, even if it's very small, more than you can. So you might not be able to really tell unless you get like a audible something, but you may get some, people exhaling quickly kind of things, where like people that are watching are realizing that like something's happening, but you may not really notice it
and
from
the other
stage.
thing with it too, when there's not a lot of people, you can feel like you gotta, if something doesn't land or whatever, you gotta feel like you gotta go really quickly. But people need a second to like take in what you just said. And so there's not a lot of people that, they're not going to be very loud, but you might take away from them, giving them a second to realize, oh, what just happened? Oh, okay. Like they need a second to respond. Yeah. There's a lot of people that need more time because you're not going to hear it. And so you're going to assume something that might not be there. So again, lack of response doesn't necessarily mean lack of engagement. So it goes back to keep preaching like you would, and don't assume like, oh, that failed miserably, because there's just not as many people. So you're not going to get as big of a response. Yeah. So those are 5 tips for preaching to a small crowd. If you're listening to this, you have, or if you have not planted a church yet, you will do this.
And that's fine.
So save this and come back to it. And you can also go to Practical Church Planting Facebook group on Facebook, type it in, or practicalplanting.com. You can get the show notes to all the episodes there. And feel free to share this podcast if you found it helpful, which we hope you have.
Yeah, please.
Feel free. So, hey, we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.